Greetings, everyone. I'm Dr. Dave Webb, and welcome to the Home Run Leadership Show. I'm here today with Pastor Jeff Sackett. And Jeff, do you want to say hey and tell a little bit about yourself and your background and experience?
Sure, yeah. I've been an ELCA pastor for a little over 32 years. I'm married, I have three children, and I'm currently serving as lead pastor at Celebration Lutheran Church in Sartell, Minnesota. And I've been a home run leadership fan from early on. Dave taught me some of these things, and we conversed about some of these things at a time that was really valuable in my life. And it's really exciting to see it become a book and a project and something that a lot of people can learn from.
Yeah, and you are like um, the very first user of home run leadership that came out of my dissertation work. So I had just finished my dissertation work 20 some years ago. Uh, Jeff and I were probably out muskie fishing together. Jeff and I are brother-in-laws, just full disclosure on the screen here. And our wives are sisters. So we had a chance to really be out musky fishing, talking about what anything under the sun. And I said, hey, there's this four-step golden strategy that all change, all decision making, all problem solving, all of them follow, and all the research uses the same core science. So it's always IROD, it's always information, reactions, options, decisions. It always follows those four steps. And Jeff was just smart enough to grab it right away. I had a one pager that I used in early on coaching people at my school site when I was an assistant principal and principal. And Jeff took that and tucked it in the back of his car. So one of his very first stories he's going to share today is about a family that called, and he happened to have that sheet of paper in his car, and he grabbed it to use it with this couple that was experiencing some challenge. So, Jeff, do you want to take it away and share a first story?
Yeah, sure. I would add that I'm probably not the first, but at least the oldest home run leadership user. But but yeah, as we go fishing, we talk about stuff all the time. And Dave, you've always been interested in my life and the things that I was doing, and we'd talk about in-depth things and not just fish, which is good because you and I don't catch a lot of muskies when we go out. But yeah, so
Very
this was
few.
this was in the back of my mind. It was something that I had thought was really kind of an interesting thing, and hadn't really thought too much about processes and conflict resolution up until that time. So I had a couple that called me late one evening. They said, "Hey, can you come to our house?" Excuse me. They just had this needed to see the pastor, and so when I got to their house, the husband was sitting on the couch. The children were kind of wandering around in a daze, and there was a big hole punched in the drywall. And the husband was saying, "I need to forgive my wife. I need to forgive my wife." And he just kept saying that over and over again. And having just had this conversation, it was in the back of my mind. I wouldn't have known what to do process wise, but I just said, "Hey, before we talk about that, can maybe just tell what happened?" And it's an innocent enough question that most people
Mhm.
in any situation will gladly tell you, the scenario of what happened. And so obviously his wife had been unfaithful to him, and there was this really emotional experience that they were going through. And so we're able to kind of go back to step one. And what you taught me early on, Dave, is that people always want to go to the end of the process. People always want to
Mhm.
jump to the conclusion. And we are a very results oriented society. We want closure. We want to be on shifting sand. And I think that's more so now than it was 20 years ago. So I said, "Hey, golly, why don't you just tell me what happened?" And so then the story kind of unfolded. And I said, "Well, how does that make you feel?" And just to try to kind of move on the process. Now the phrase that I tend to use more with people is just to say, "Put a name on that emotion for me. Just tell me what that emotion is." That allows people the release that they really need for the really powerful thing that's within them, whether it's joy or anger or resentment or whatever it is. It's just so important to get the emotions out there. And I've learned since then, running this process enough times and other experiences in my ministry, that you cannot get anywhere when you're trying to go against people's emotional strength. if you ever read the book Switch, where they talk about change in people's lives, they actually describe use the metaphor of the emotions are like an elephant. They just trample everything. So, hey, put a name on that emotion for me, and so you can kind of move along. And then in a long process, and obviously not in one late evening with a couple who's had a really terrible thing happen, say down the road, what do you think some of the options are for you as a couple or whatever the situation may be, and then hopefully you can lead people to a resolution and to make a decision at the end of a process, and it just feels way more satisfying, way more rock solid than it does to kind of jump ahead. And what gets missed is the emotional power and then the clarity of what some of those options might be.
And if I could just compliment you on three things that I just want to highlight and recap for what you said is everyone wants to jump to a decision right away. So if somebody says, I need to forgive my wife, or let's make a decision on what we're going to do with our relationship tonight, um, there's time for that. There's space for it, but it doesn't have to be the first thing. So you were able, because of the science, to guide them back. And then you had a golden question tucked in your back pocket, which is just, can you tell me what happened? So I can't tell you the number of times as an assistant principal. I was an assistant principal for 5 years, and there'd be conflict in the school and an occasional fight during the school day. You get the kids down to the office and you try to separate them into different rooms. And the first question is always, hey, can you just tell me what happened? And then can you write down what happened? So the fact that you keep using that and have for 20 years is golden. And then once you get all of what happened, the story, oftentimes in a real emotional situation like that, that can take 20 to 30 minutes just to get the whole story out. And then you got to second base. Once you got the whole story, you were able to go to second base and you've adapted the question for one that just works really well for you, which is just, can you put a name on that emotion? So it sounds a lot better and maybe less touchy-feely than, can you tell me how you're feeling? And you restructured the question well, made it usable for you, your line of work, and the people you serve. And it's just a really good question. Can you put a name on that emotion? It's a great second base question. So three huge wins there in just one story. So way to go.
Oh, it's an amazing process, and I think we could be lost if we didn't have something tucked away there that are just kind of those touchstone places where we want to go with people. Um, 2 years ago, we had a lady in our church who lost her son during COVID. He was 34 years old. He was just this graceful, beautiful soul. He was a wonderful young man, and he didn't die of COVID, but he died during that time. And it
Mm.
was a woman who I did not know very well, but had attended our church. And when I got to their house and said, "Hey, what happened?" and let them tell me the story, this heartbreaking story. And it was 2 years ago, almost this month, because I just had a 2 year catch up, and I try to go back to people, on the anniversary of those kind of dates and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about you today. I know that you're getting up to that really powerful emotional date, but boy, put a name on that emotion." And just for a mom to have the opportunity to say, "I am devastated. I'm devastated." I just can't tell you how powerful that is. You have to get to that place where a person shares that with you. And in that case, there were really not a lot of options, but still that touchstone was there to just get me in the door and say, "I'm here. I care about you. Please tell me what happened. Your story matters, and then in your emotions matter." And in a situation like that, that there's just no end to a mother's grief, and that there are other things that just continue to weigh on a person when they have that kind of tragic thing happen in their life. But
If I
it
can
works.
just, right? Can I just stay on the grief there? Because I have a copy of your incredibly nice note to parents when there was a middle school suicide that actually played out in your community. And you took time to write to the entire community about how can we really support our students at this difficult time. And you said, begin by asking, and when you're having conversations with your own kids, begin by asking what happened and who was this person and do you know about him or her? And really, it's a good place to open up to just get grounded on helping to support your own kid in light of a school suicide. You then went to just to really check in with your own kids to see how they're feeling. And again, can you put a name on an emotion that you might be feeling? And you shared about just asking, what can we do now to really reach out to others and hug and support one another? And I just thought it was beautiful and brilliant. And you got it up and out to congregation members and up and out on the community and up and out on Facebook. And we're able to give and support people and support to people who really needed it at that time. So just a huge home run.
But it's the kind of thing that if you have that process in place, then you don't even really have to you don't really even have to try to create anything out of your own wisdom. You know what I mean? Like in
Mhm.
the heat of the moment of caring for people, I could potentially say something that I wish that I hadn't said later, or it just keeps me very controlled. It keeps
Yeah.
me on a path that I know, and I know where I want to get with that person. In that case, um, we went to see the family the night that it happened, and they weren't seeing people. And
Mhm.
so when the family finally did come to see me, the mother, I went out to the parking lot when I saw them coming and to greet them, and the mother said, "I don't even want to see you because when I see you, that's when I know that this is real." So the depth of emotion that people experience in those kind of times is it can take you as a leader on a wild ride, but when you have this process in place, then you can touch all those bases and you know that you're getting those people down as healthy a road as possible, the whole time being present for them. So you end up sounding a lot wiser than you are. I really don't think that it's not really an expression of my wisdom so much as just to say, this is the process I'm going to use, and it
Right.
just works. It works because it's so well thought out.
You had I hate to stay on the theme of tragedy, but you had a tragic situation with your own church in your previous congregation
Yeah,
where the church actually burned to the ground.
yeah.
And do you want to give the background and then just share some of those base running? There's so many opportunities to base run when you have a tragedy like that.
Yeah.
But do you want to just share a few of
Yeah,
the
sure.
stories that tied with
Yeah.
that?
Yep. It was January of 2000, and I was at home with my wife and kids. I think the kids were in bed at that point, and we got a phone call that our church was on fire, and it was a relatively old building in a country setting, and we drove just a couple miles to where the church was, and the firemen were working on the church, and it was pretty much engulfed in flames fairly quickly. But it was a Saturday night, which means on Sunday morning people are showing up for worship, and what they're finding is this big pile of ash, and this important landmark in their lives is gone, and so it's just I can't even you know
Yeah.
for some people it's the loss of a family member or someone they love. This is more of a community loss where a guy named Dan, who was a neighbor of mine, pulled up and opened up his truck window and said, "This is where I was baptized. This is where I was married." I mean, it just has the site, the place, that sense of place has such strong draw for people. And so to kind of get the information out to people and say, hey, this is what happened. And I think in that case, the jump that people make, because everybody makes it, myself included, you do too, Dave, because
I
it's just
do.
human, we're wired that
Yep.
way. Well, what will happen next, Pastor? What will we build, and where will we build it? And of course, being the gung ho young pastor who wants to solve everybody's problem and be the great leader, just said, "Well, I think we should do this or that," and we're talking over the fence about different options and not even thinking at all about the emotional upheaval that was going. And so now you're already going down the road of, well, maybe we should relocate to a place where we can attract more people. And then right away, there's this undercurrent in the community saying, well, Pastor Jeff wants to relocate. I don't go to church to watch cars drive by. Just it's just all of this. Or there was a rumor then going around that my wife had an education degree and that we wanted to build a big building so that we could have a preschool, so my wife could have a good paying job and I could too. Just all that stuff just gets let loose when
Right.
you are in this case probably allowed to sort of let people draw you on to that conclusion. If I had that moment over, I would say this is what we know.
We call that stealing bases or skipping bases,
Yeah,
right? If you
you
skip
were.
a base,
Yeah.
it comes out of the woodwork at you,
Well, I mean, what happens in baseball when you skip a base? You get thrown out.
right?
You're out of the game. You can't even you're out of the play. And so, you
Right.
know, I wish I could go back and just say, hey, this is what we know. This happened. Our building is gone. We're gonna today on Sunday we'll be worshiping at the town hall in Palmer, and then we'll just go from there. And the less I say, the better. And I'm just a total blabbermouth. I should just shut up most of the time, but especially in really high emotion situations like that. And then as the process unfolded, you know, like I said, people's emotions were high. There was then there gets to be this sort of division in the congregation, and there are people who had lived there their whole lives saying, "We've lived here our whole lives. We should get to decide." These new people have been here for just a couple of years. They don't have the investment that we do, and now you're riding herd over this really difficult emotional situation. Now, I'll tell
Right.
you what happened that was sweet, and it was IROD, and we didn't even know it. I
Good.
had a mentor pastor who was working with me. His name was Richard Moore. God rest his soul. He's not alive anymore, but he
Sure.
was working with me through the ELCA division of outreach, and we were visiting. And he said, "Jeff, if I were you, I would have a funeral for your building."
Wow.
And so we had a time where we actually invited people to come and grieve and tell
Wow.
stories about the building and mourn about the fact that it
Mhm.
was gone and say this is how much it meant to them. And when you
Wow.
look at it, that's step two, right? That's helping
Yeah.
people function
It's
with their
actually, yeah, let me go this way. It's all of first and second base. So people are sharing stories, but they're sharing all their reactions with those stories. So it's first and second base all combined together. It's like when you ask a kid coming out of a fight in the cafeteria, what happened? You get all of first and second mixed together. So it's just a big mush. But
yeah,
that's when those stories of, yeah, I grew up here. I was baptized here. I got married here. It's a lot of first and second.
yeah. And so then our congregation went through, kind of I feel like then just out of the wisdom of my friend Dick Mork, who was such a sweet soul, to say, "Hey, I think we missed a step here." And I know that that was
Mhm.
IROD in my world, but still, oh yeah,
Sure.
this really would be helpful. And that congregation has a lovely building today. They have a
Yeah.
I just saw a post on Facebook today of all these
Mm.
kids who had done a big food scavenger hunt and just 50 kids in front of a big
Yeah.
pile of food that they're distributing to the local food shelf. They have a beautiful
Great.
pastoral spot where they still do ministry, and so
Mhm.
um, they have what they need, and it worked out fine. But you really have to work that process. And here's the other thing that I would maybe wonder back to you, Dave. But I think a lot of
Yeah.
it sometimes has to do with our own motivation to be great leaders, and so we
Mhm.
cast that thing way out there and
Yeah.
say, "Let's do this."
Yeah.
And you'd be much better leader if you'd walk along this process and say, "Hey, what happened, man? What are we feeling now? What do we think some of our options are?" Rather than to just sort of cast ahead. Maybe you've heard the old saying that you should never get too far ahead of your troops because they'll think you're the enemy and shoot you. And
That's a pretty good quote. And honestly, I told my board chair, I've now retired as superintendent, but before I left, I said one of the new guy mistakes that I made years, the first couple of years in is as a new superintendent, you try to do it all and you try to answer it all and you try to be all. And then once you get a few years under your belt, you say, hey, I need to follow my team. I need to support my team, the 14 district leaders that are out there in food service and transportation and finance and HR and everything else, because they're going to do the heavy lifting. They're the experts, and you need to support them. Don't get in front of them. So,
and
way to
I
go.
think that I do think that we have these sort of delusions of grandeur that we're going to be a great leader. We're going to cast a vision. There's
Right.
great pressure in churches as there is in schools to be great leaders. That's
Yeah.
just what the world needs. And then you
Right.
realize, no, it's something quite different. It's can you guide people through this process to discover that within themselves to then you got 14 great leaders who are
Right.
equipping another 100 great leaders to really lead and do that work that they're called to do instead of, but I think it has a lot to do with our ego. I got to a point where
Mm,
I was in therapy and I was telling my therapist, if we don't
yeah.
build a great building, I'm not a great pastor. And she said,
Right.
well, let's just talk about that a little more, because, it's
And
about,
can I go there for a second? Because I had
yes.
a guy at one of my recent training sessions, business leader, a great business leader, business is doing great things. And he says, Dave, is it all about hitting home runs like all the time? And I said, no, if you really want to know the truth, it's about hitting single after single after single after single. You're trying to just get to first. So your golden question about, hey, can you tell me what happened? Just gets you to first base.
Yeah.
You got a single. And can you hit another single essentially and get to second with your team
Yeah.
and to third and home? So he says that makes a whole lot more sense than home runs every time. And that's what you're so good at. So
But single leadership, hitting singles leadership wouldn't be as good a book title, right? It's
exactly right.
Here's the interesting thing too. Even as you're saying that, I'm recognizing that I used IROD today without even realizing that I was doing it because it's become so natural. A lady in our congregation felt a real nudge to create an event for seniors.
Hmm.
And when they first put it up and they said, "Hey, 55 and older," I looked up and went, "Man, I'm a senior citizen. I could go to this." And she came into my office today, and I had not been at that event because I think I was on sabbatical at that time, but
Sure.
she emailed me and said, I really feel like this was a great event. Can I talk to you about it? And I said, sure. So she came in my office with this giant folder of ideas. And I said, hey, tell me what happened. Tell me what
Way to
happened.
go.
Tell me what happened at the first lunch bunch for seniors. Oh, we
Yeah.
know we did this, we did that. Well, how do you feel about that? Oh, I feel
Yeah.
great, but I'm a little nervous, expectations, this and that. I said, well, what are our options? She wanted to get my opinion, about how things were
Yeah.
to go. I said, what do you think the options are? If you're going to do it once a month and the second
Yeah.
Tuesday or whatever. Well, looks like we've got some decisions. And I said to her, wouldn't it be great if more people could follow their passion along this line to say, boy, I think there's something that could be helpful for our community.
Hmm.
But it really, I used it today. Didn't
Yeah.
even remember that I was doing it. It's become such a
Right.
natural part of conversation to
That's
say, oh, how
awesome.
did that go? How did that event go? Oh, good. How did that make you feel? So I don't know, just
Way
go
to
to show
go.
you how natural it can be. You know what you're going
Right.
for.
And I'm gonna so you shared your first home runs, your go-to home runs, incredible stories about your church and church leadership. Before we close today, do you have a time where you always have a go-to like this? I know I'm always pulling these same questions out, or is there a time where you just always use the same four questions?
Mostly in times of crisis or times of pastoral care, or when I get to some place and I don't know what has happened at all.
Right.
That can happen in staffing situations too. But a
Hmm.
lot of times I'm kind of sort of in the flow with my staff, which is a lot smaller than a larger like a school district or things like that. But anytime that I'm going into an unknown
Yeah.
situation, and I'll just briefly share the other story that I've told you, which is I went to see a lead pastor of another congregation. Someone from her staff had
Right.
applied for a job on our staff, and on our way, my colleague said, "Hey, what are we going to say when we get there?" Assuming that the pastor at the other church was not going to be happy that someone was from their staff was applied for a position on ours. And I said, "Well,
Right.
we'll ask him, hey, what's happening here? What do we know? And
Right.
how does that make us feel? How does that make you feel? What do we think some of our options are?" And when we left, we had a productive conversation. When we left, my colleague said, "I think they like us better now than they did when we got there." So there's
Right,
just
but
that.
look at what you did there. You restored that relationship. You were palms up, you shared information, got their reactions,
Yeah.
talked about options, and you crossed home plate. Granted, the person might have come to your church, but the other team was able to let go and really mourn the loss and really be able to give them up and release them. You help restore the relationship between the two of your churches. So huge home run.
And don't you think this process really values people on a level that a lot of times they don't get valued at, which is, hey, tell me your story, tell me what's going on. I mean, that's a key question for
Yeah,
me nowadays, whether I'm doing IROD or not. Is, hey,
yeah,
what's your story? You ask someone that, and
yeah.
they'll just go right at it. They'll tell you exactly who they are because you're expressing some interest and some care in who they are as a person. And in an IROD situation, then you could flow on through to say, hey, put a name on that emotion for me. What do we think some of our options are? Just you got to come work with my council someday, Dave, so that people
Yeah.
can be that can get that process in their heads as deeply as it's wormed its way into mine.
I'd love to do it. Just the door's open. If you can find a date, I'm
Yeah,
always happy to do governing board training. The piece that I always bring in is what I think most governing boards struggle with is that governance versus management role. Like if governing boards really can just get reminded of their key role as high level finance, making sure they're focused on policy, uh, for sure the public relations and community relations in the church, and then supervision of the pastor and support of the pastor. If you can really stay focused on those four core, you're way ahead as a governing board. And then you don't have to get sucked into all the different minutia about hiring a particular staff member or recommendations for all the things that happen day to day that you really manage as a pastor. And it
staff.
elevates you and supports you too.
I can go deeper than staff. I mean, I can remember sitting in a council meeting and saying, "Why are we talking about a $300 ice maker for the kitchen?" It's
Yeah,
just
there you go.
I had a guy who visited me just today who said, "We need a new lawnmower." And it was just, okay,
Right.
but that's not what we're going to do at council next
Right.
month. It's just not. And so you have to get
Exactly.
people out of the minutia and more in the flow of managing these larger places. And it's easier to say than it is to do because people
So
want results.
yeah, so thanks again, Jeff, for being on for today. Great job, great stories. Thanks for being the first, like you say, the oldest
I'll
user
be
of
the oldest.
home run, the oldest user of home run leadership. For being on today, we'd like to give you free access to the $500 course that we built for home run leadership. It's 21 videos that just parallel the 21 chapters of our book. So stay on, and I'll get you the free code for that
Love it.
too.
Yeah, love it.
Do
And
you have
I'll stick
any
by
other
the
words
word.
of advice?
I just will
Yeah.
stick by what I said on the jacket cover, which is my theological training I got at seminary. I learned to lead from this stuff. I really did, and I
Yeah.
appreciate it very much.
Yeah. Well, you're an awesome leader. Great job today. And thanks, everyone. If you want to keep tuning into Home Run Leadership shows, they're on YouTube. We try to get one up and out weekly. And we always say and close with if you want to go great places, keep running the bases. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jeff.